There's a strange kind of silence at Apple. Not the silence of stagnation, but the silence before a storm. For years, the company that once changed how we communicate, create, and even think has been quiet. No flashy revolutions, no iPhone-level shocks, just whispers of something new. Under timcooks.com and calculated leadership, Apple transformed from a maker of devices into the architect of an entire ecosystem where every sound, every pixel, every heartbeat connects. But now, the question echoes louder than ever. Is Apple still the world's most innovative company, or is it about to reinvent itself once again? Because somewhere deep inside Cupertino, something is awakening. A new chapter in Apple's story, written not in code or glass, but in intelligence itself. Tim Cook's story begins far from the bright lights of Silicon Valley, in the quiet town of Robertsdale, Alabama. Raised in the Deep South, Cook grew up surrounded by the values of humility, discipline, and consistency. There was nothing flamboyant about his childhood, no early signs of the revolutionary he would later become. Yet beneath his soft-spoken demeanor, there was a meticulous mind drawn to order, efficiency, and purpose. Long before he stepped onto Apple's stage, Cook was mastering the invisible art of precision, a quality that would later define his leadership style. When he joined Apple in 1998, the company was on the brink of collapse. But under Steve Jobs, the visionary genius, and Cook, the silent strategist, Apple began its climb toward becoming the most valuable company in the world. When Jobs passed away in 2011, the world mourned not just a man, but an idea, the embodiment of creative rebellion. Apple without Jobs felt unthinkable. The markets trembled, fans grieved, and the tech world waited for the inevitable fall. Tim Cook, the man who had quietly managed Apple's global operations, suddenly stood at the center of the stage. To many, he was a caretaker, not a creator, a steward of efficiency, not a visionary. The question lingered like a shadow over every keynote. How do you lead a company built by a legend? In those early years, skepticism was everywhere. Critics accused Cook of being too cautious, too corporate, too safe. The world wanted another Steve Jobs, a man who could conjure magic from aluminum and glass. But Cook never tried to fill those shoes. Instead, he built a different kind of legacy, one rooted in stability, inclusivity, and ethics. Where Jobs had led through intuition and charisma, Cook led through quiet conviction and strategic clarity. He turned Apple into a company that no longer depended on a single man's vision, but on a shared philosophy of excellence. Under Cook's guidance, Apple's culture began to evolve. The once secretive, top-down empire became more open, more collaborative, and surprisingly, more human. Cook emphasized empathy and privacy, seeing technology not as a tool to dominate, but as an extension of personal trust. His belief was simple: the most advanced innovation should still protect the individual. In a world that increasingly traded privacy for convenience, Cook drew a line, and that principle became Apple's new moral compass. Simplicity remained at Apple's core, but it began to mean something deeper. It was no longer just about design, it was about intention. Cook understood that true innovation is invisible. It hides behind ease, beauty, and security. Every product that left Cupertino under his watch, from the Apple Watch to the M-series chips, carried this quiet philosophy. It was not about dazzling the world with spectacle. It was about building an ecosystem that worked so seamlessly, people could forget it was even there. As years passed, Apple's identity transformed from that of a creative disruptor to a global institution. The company no longer chased chaos. It cultivated consistency. To some, that shift felt like a loss of magic. But to others, it was the sign of a company growing up, finding peace after decades of revolution. Cook's Apple didn't shout, it whispered. And in that whisper, the world began to hear something profound, a promise of technology that respected human dignity. In the end, Tim Cook didn't try to be the next Steve Jobs. He understood that legends are not meant to be replicated, they are meant to be continued. His strength wasn't in replacing Apple's past, but in safeguarding its soul while quietly guiding it into a new age. As history would later show, Cook never wanted to be the next Steve Jobs. He wanted to be the first Tim Cook. When Steve Jobs passed away, Apple didn't just lose a CEO, it lost its heartbeat of unpredictability. For years, the company had lived off a rhythm of revelation. Every keynote was a global event, every product unveiling a cultural moment. But as the dust of mourning settled, the world began to ask an uncomfortable question. Where was the wow now? The iPhone, once a miracle in the palm of your hand, had become familiar. Each new iteration felt like refinement, not reinvention. The lightning bolts of innovation that defined the Jobs era were replaced by careful, incremental progress. For a company that had built its mythology around surprise, this period felt eerily quiet. The silence that once symbolized mystery began to sound like doubt. Wall Street noticed. Investors wanted spectacle numbers that rose like Apple's old headlines. The tech community, too, began to whisper. Had Apple lost its soul? Competitors like Samsung and Google were moving fast, experimenting with bold designs and open ecosystems. The media labeled Apple predictable. Critics said Cook was too safe, too focused on spreadsheets instead of inspiration. For a company used to being adored, the criticism cut deep. Cook was under immense pressure to prove that Apple could still lead, not just follow. But unlike Jobs, his response wasn't emotional. It was structural. He didn't chase headlines. He built foundations. At the same time, Apple faced turbulence in its global operations. The iPhone, its golden goose, was hitting a plateau. The market was saturated, especially in China, where cheaper competitors flooded the landscape. Manufacturing challenges and political tensions began to threaten Apple's seamless global machine. For any other company, such dependence on a single product and a single manufacturing region might have spelled disaster. But Cook, the master of logistics, saw it differently. He began diversifying production networks, reinforcing Apple's supply chain like a fortress. The genius of Steve Jobs had been in creating products people desired. Cook's genius was in ensuring those products reached every corner of the world perfectly, reliably, and profitably. Behind the scenes, however, a quiet revolution was beginning. Cook realized that the next frontier wasn't in devices alone, it was in experiences. Apple's power wasn't just in hardware, but in how its ecosystem made people feel connected, safe, empowered. So, he began to shift Apple's strategy away from a single product dependence and toward something more sustainable, a symphony of interconnected offerings. He poured resources into wearables, services, and artificial intelligence. Apple Watch redefined personal health. AirPods turned wireless listening into a lifestyle. iCloud, Apple Music, and App Store subscriptions became a steady river of recurring revenue. This was Apple's pivot from selling devices to building a universe. It was a subtle but radical transformation. The company that once sold innovation now sold integration. Every device became a gateway, every app a bridge, every user a citizen in the Apple ecosystem. It was no longer about inventing the next iPhone. It was about ensuring that everything Apple touched worked in unison with divine simplicity. While competitors chased novelty, Apple refined harmony. And that harmony proved to be far more profitable, enduring, and scalable. This pivot also marked a philosophical shift from innovation in design to innovation in experience. Cook understood that the future of technology wasn't in more buttons, more pixels, or faster chips. It was in how seamlessly technology could disappear into human life. Apple's design language matured into something almost spiritual, minimal, quiet, and deeply human. Each product felt less like a gadget and more like a companion. The company that once sold the dream of creativity now sold the comfort of continuity. Many outside the company mistook Apple's restraint for decline. But inside Cupertino, Cook's engineers and strategists knew the truth. The company wasn't slowing down, it was transforming. The fireworks of invention had turned into the architecture of endurance. And while the world waited for Apple's next big thing, Cook was building something bigger. A future-proof ecosystem that could outlast any product cycle. This was not a fall, it was a transformation. By the mid-2010s, Apple stood at a crossroads. Its crown jewel, the iPhone, was no longer a story of endless growth, but of mature dominance. To some, that seemed like the beginning of the end. To Tim Cook, it was the beginning of something greater. Apple's next act wasn't about a single product. It was about constructing an entire world, where every device, every service, and every line of code existed in perfect harmony. This was the era of the Apple ecosystem, an invisible web of integration so seamless that it would redefine what convenience meant in the modern age. The rise of the Apple Watch in 2015 marked the start of this transformation. What began as an accessory to the iPhone quietly evolved into one of the most personal devices ever made, a health companion, fitness tracker, a silent guardian that watched over its user's heart. Then came the AirPods, dismissed at launch as overpriced earphones, but soon embraced as a cultural icon. They were not just tools for listening. They were a declaration of identity, the embodiment of effortless connectivity. Together, these products created a new rhythm in the Apple experience: intimate, invisible, indispensable. As these devices multiplied, so did Apple's reach beyond hardware. The company leaned into services: Apple Music, iCloud, TV Plus, Arcade, turning its ecosystem into a self-sustaining digital economy. Each service was designed not as an add-on, but as an extension of the user's life. The genius lay in the integration. Messages synced across devices. Photos appeared everywhere, and handoffs between Macs and iPhones felt almost telepathic. This wasn't convenience, it was orchestration. Apple's vision of the future wasn't about faster specs or flashier designs. It was about creating technology that worked so perfectly you stopped noticing it altogether. In an age of complexity, Apple offered clarity. This clarity came from what critics called the walled garden, a closed system where Apple controlled everything: hardware, software, and the experience in between. To outsiders, it was restrictive, even authoritarian. To insiders, it was brilliance. By owning every piece of the experience, Apple could guarantee not only quality, but harmony. Security, privacy, performance, all thrived under this model. And while other companies battled fragmentation, Apple cultivated unity. It was the same principle that had guided Steve Jobs years before, now refined through Cook's operational discipline. The result was an ecosystem so integrated that once you stepped inside, it became almost impossible to leave. Not because you were trapped, but because you no longer wanted to. Behind these consumer-facing innovations were the M-series chips, arguably one of the most audacious technological bets in Apple's history. Breaking away from reliance on Intel, Apple decided to build its own silicon chips that were not only faster and more efficient, but tailor-made for the Apple ecosystem. It was a move that redefined computing efficiency, giving Macs new life and setting the stage for a future where hardware and software fused into one living entity. Alongside this came Apple's early steps into privacy-first AI intelligence systems that operated on-device, learning from users without ever harvesting their data. In a world increasingly dominated by data exploitation, Apple's stance felt radical, even moral. Cook was signaling that the future of artificial intelligence didn't have to come at the cost of human dignity. Each of these decisions, from wearables to custom chips to privacy-driven AI, formed the foundation for what would soon become Apple's boldest leap yet: spatial computing and the Vision Pro. While others raced to dominate the metaverse or flood the market with AI hype, Apple quietly built the infrastructure, the devices, processing power, the design language, and the trust that would make such a world possible. It wasn't about being first, it was about being inevitable. When Vision Pro finally arrived, it didn't feel like an experiment. It felt like the natural next step of a story that had been carefully written for over a decade. Yet even amid triumph, Apple faced its critics. Some accused the company of becoming too safe, too closed, too obsessed with control. They argued that Apple's tight grip on its ecosystem stifled innovation and creativity from the outside world. But Cook understood something deeper: that chaos is not the same as freedom. By curating the experience, Apple wasn't limiting creativity. It was protecting the sanctity of user trust. In a digital age overflowing with noise, scams, and surveillance, Apple's garden, though walled, felt like a sanctuary. And as the company's valuations soared past trillions, as its devices became extensions of identity, and as its influence seeped into culture, health, and even privacy law, one truth became clear. Apple had outgrown the need to chase the next big thing. The world thought Apple was following the future, but it wasn't. It was quietly designing one of its own. Apple wasn't chasing the future, it was building its own universe. For years, Apple's rhythm felt almost predictable: steady releases, refined upgrades, quiet dominance. But beneath that calm surface, a storm had been brewing. Tim Cook and his most trusted engineers were working on something that wasn't just another product, but a new dimension. Entirely, while the world debated whether Apple had lost its magic, the company was quietly preparing for its boldest leap since the iPhone, a leap into spatial computing. This was not a simple hardware update. It was the attempt to blur the boundary between the physical and the digital, between what is seen and what is experienced. The Apple Vision Pro, unveiled in 2023, is the culmination of a decade of secretive research, an artifact of immense ambition and audacious risk. It represented Apple's conviction that the next interface wouldn't be a screen we touched, but a space we lived inside. The philosophy behind Vision Pro was deeply humanistic. It wasn't about escaping reality as the metaverse promised. It was about enhancing it. Apple's engineers envisioned a future where digital elements would no longer feel foreign. They would feel native to human perception. In this new world, the living room could transform into a workspace, a cinema, or a gateway to memory. Every gesture, every glance, every sound was designed to interact with the machine in ways that felt instinctive and natural. Apple called it spatial computing, but at its heart, it was something more intimate, a technology that understood space, emotion, and attention. It was Apple's attempt to redefine not how we use technology, but how we coexist with it. This vision, however, came at an extraordinary cost. Apple spent billions in R&D, developing custom lenses, micro-OLED displays, and sensors capable of tracking every flicker of the human eye. The Vision Pro's design demanded breakthroughs in both hardware and software that many believed were impossible to scale. Inside Cupertino's labs, engineers fought countless battles with physics itself, balancing performance, heat, comfort, and latency. What emerged was not a mass-market gadget, but a technological marvel, a prototype of the future wrapped in aluminum and glass. The risk was enormous. If it failed, it could mark Apple's most expensive misstep since the Newton. But Cook, ever the strategist, understood that some revolutions don't start with profit, they start with proof. Investors, however, were not as patient. Wall Street questioned whether Apple was stepping into a fading dream, the same virtual and augmented reality markets that had humbled Meta and Google. Analysts called Vision Pro a luxury experiment, a product without an audience. Even within the tech community, cultural skepticism ran high. Was Apple still leading innovation, or merely chasing relevance in a post-iPhone world? But Cook remained silent. He didn't argue with critics, he waited. That patience, almost stoic in its steadiness, had become his signature. Cook understood what few others did, that paradigm shifts are not loud. They begin quietly, with the hum of early adopters and the patience of time. His faith was not unfounded. The Vision Pro's strength lay not in its novelty, but in its ecosystem. Apple had spent years constructing a closed but powerful universe: iCloud, Cloud Apple Silicon, App Store, and seamless integration across devices. Vision Pro was not an isolated headset. It was an extension of that ecosystem. Every photo stored, every message received, every app designed for iPhone or Mac, all could live effortlessly within this new reality. The same privacy principles, design, language, and security architecture that defined Apple's previous products became Vision Pro's hidden advantage. Competitors could replicate the hardware, but not the harmony. What set Apple apart was its understanding of experience. Vision Pro wasn't meant to be a headset, it was a portal. It allowed users to move through digital environments as naturally as they breathe. In Apple's vision, screens would fade away, replaced by digital layers woven seamlessly into the fabric of reality. This wasn't science fiction, it was a slow evolution of human-computer interaction. Cook's strategy wasn't to dominate instantly, but to seed a transformation that would unfold over years. Just as the first iPhone had once seemed overpriced and unnecessary, Vision Pro's true impact would only be understood in hindsight. Tim Cook had spent more than a decade turning Apple into a fortress of stability. Now, he was betting that fortress on the unknown. It was a risk few CEOs would dare take, but that's what separated Apple from its rivals. Vision Pro was not merely another product launch, it was Apple's declaration that innovation is not about louder screens or faster chips, but about dissolving the line between reality and imagination. And as the world watched, uncertain and intrigued, one truth began to crystallize. If the iPhone changed how we connect, Vision Pro might change what it means to exist. In the wake of Apple's continued dominance, the glow of perfection began to show its cracks. The company that once symbolized the bleeding edge of innovation now faced whispers, then headlines, accusing it of stagnation. Critics argued that Apple no longer invented the future, simply refined it. Prices climbed higher with each product cycle, and even the most loyal fans began to ask whether elegance had replaced excitement. What was once revolutionary was now incremental. The walled garden that had once been. Apple's strength, a sanctuary of seamless integration and reliability, started to be seen by many as a gilded cage. Developers complained of restrictive policies, consumers questioned the cost of belonging to Apple's ecosystem, and regulators took notice of the monopoly-like control Apple exercised over its digital world. The App Store, once a symbol of empowerment for developers, became the epicenter of Apple's public battles. Antitrust lawsuits erupted, accusing the company of unfairly taking its 30% commission, limiting alternative payment methods, and favoring its own apps. Governments from the US to the EU began investigating Apple's dominance, forcing the company to defend not just its profits but its philosophy. Behind the glass walls of Cupertino, Apple's legal and policy teams worked quietly, framing every defense not as a corporate maneuver, but as a moral stance that Apple's strict ecosystem wasn't about greed, it was about safety. In Cook's eyes, control was not the opposite of freedom, but its guardian. At the same time, the world was entering a new digital battlefield: privacy. Data had become the new oil, and tech giants were mining every trace of human behavior for profit. Apple saw an opportunity to distinguish itself, positioning privacy not as a feature but as a right. With each keynote, Apple doubled down on this principle: what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. It was a statement loaded with both confidence and quiet defiance. But even this stance invited scrutiny. Could a trillion-dollar company truly protect user privacy while operating in markets where censorship and surveillance were state policy? Apple's silence on certain issues, particularly in China, raised difficult questions about where ethics end and business begins. For Tim Cook, these weren't just business dilemmas, they were moral ones. Known for his calm, measured presence, Cook approached global controversies with diplomacy rather than confrontation. He became the face of corporate responsibility, championing renewable energy, supply chain transparency, and inclusivity. Under his leadership, Apple's operations turned greener, its supply chain cleaner, and its narrative more human. Yet behind every environmental initiative and human rights statement, there remained the tension of scale. How could Apple remain good when its influence had grown so vast that every action or inaction carried global consequence? Cook understood that Apple's reputation was not built merely on innovation, but on integrity, and preserving that integrity had become his greatest test. As artificial intelligence began reshaping the tech landscape, a new challenge emerged. Apple, long a symbol of control and privacy, now had to navigate a world where OpenAI models thrived on vast amounts of shared data. Competitors like Google and OpenAI embraced the philosophy of openness and experimentation, while Apple stood firm in its privacy-first principles. This created a paradox. How could Apple build intelligent systems without compromising the very privacy it promised to protect? The company's path forward demanded a reimagining of AI, not as a tool of exploitation, but as an extension of personal empowerment. Apple's AI had to think differently, not just in function, but in philosophy. This, however, deepened the central tension at the heart of Apple's existence: freedom versus control. Every Apple product promised freedom from clutter, from confusion, from complexity, yet that very simplicity came from Apple's control over every detail. The closed ecosystem that delivered flawless user experiences also limited user autonomy. Apple's brand purity depended on this duality. Too much openness, and it risked chaos. Too much control, and it risked becoming the very kind of authoritarian entity it had once defined itself against. The question lingered beneath every keynote and every design choice: was Apple protecting users, or protecting itself. And yet, through every controversy, lawsuit, and philosophical debate, one truth endured. People still believed in Apple. They still lined up outside stores, trusted the brand with their data, wove Apple devices into the fabric of their lives. It's in an era defined by mistrust, fake news, manipulated algorithms, and digital exploitation, Apple remained, somehow, the exception. That trust, fragile yet enduring, was not the byproduct of marketing, but of consistency, of a moral narrative carefully upheld over decades. In the end, Apple's greatest creation was not a phone, a chip, or a headset. It was something invisible, the belief that in a chaotic digital world there could still exist a company that put the user first. Apple's greatest product was never a device, it was trust. The silence that once defined Apple's strategy has begun to hum with a new kind of energy. The quiet, deliberate rhythm of reinvention. After years of being seen as a follower in the AI race, Apple is now making its most decisive move yet, Apple Intelligence. But true to its DNA, this is not AI as the world knows it. There are no flashy demonstrations of autonomous machines or viral chatbot moments. Instead, Apple's approach is subtle, deeply integrated, and profoundly personal. It's not about creating intelligence that replaces humans. It's about enhancing the one that already exists. The company that once taught the world how to touch technology is now teaching it how to understand us. This marks the beginning of Apple's AI renaissance, a rebirth rooted not in imitation, but in redefinition. While Silicon Valley rushed to scale massive language models and flood the internet with generative content, Apple turned inward, asking a different question. What if intelligence didn't live in the cloud, but in your pocket? The answer lies in on-device processing, a philosophy that marries performance, privacy, and human-centered design. With the launch of Apple Intelligence, your iPhone no longer just follows commands. It interprets context, remembers preferences, and acts with quiet intuition. It's not just smart, it's aware. This shift represents the culmination of a decade-long journey under Tim Cook, the steady evolution from hardware excellence to experiential intelligence. Where other companies see AI as a race for dominance, Apple treats it as a dialogue between human and machine. The company envisions a future where personalization doesn't mean surveillance, and intelligence doesn't mean intrusion. Every AI-generated suggestion, every adaptive feature, is processed locally, protected by the same encryption principles that have defined Apple's brand. It's a paradox that only Apple could attempt, to make technology more personal without making it more invasive. But this renaissance also redefines Apple's position in the global AI arms race. The competitors are formidable. Google, OpenAI, and Meta are moving fast, each trying to define what AI should become. Google invests in scale and data. OpenAI bets on general intelligence. Meta pursues social integration and openness. Apple, however, walks alone, choosing intimacy over intensity, privacy over power, human experience over algorithmic expansion. To Apple, AI is not a spectacle, it's a service. It's not about replacing creativity, but amplifying it. It's not about talking to machines, but making machines that listen better. This philosophy is also the backbone of Apple's next leap, the merging of AI with spatial computing through Vision Pro. Imagine an interface that doesn't just respond to your voice or gestures, but anticipates your needs, understands your focus, and adapts in real time. Vision Pro becomes more than a device. It's an extension of your perception. Combined with Apple Intelligence, it transforms from a headset into something closer to a companion, one that learns, evolves, and quietly supports without demanding attention. The boundaries between device and self, between digital and physical, begin to dissolve. At the heart of this transformation stands Tim Cook, a man whose leadership was once described as cautious, but is now revealed to be visionary in its patience. Cook's genius lies not in radical disruption, but in orchestration, guiding Apple through quiet revolutions that unfold over years. His vision for AI is not one of domination, but harmony, a future where artificial intelligence feels invisible, human, and deeply personal. Under Cook, Apple's AI future is not about machines that think like humans, but about humans who feel more empowered through machines. And so, as Apple steps fully into the AI era, its mission remains surprisingly unchanged: to make technology serve humanity, not consume it. In an age where algorithms grow louder and more intrusive, Apple's greatest innovation may be its restraint. Its pursuit is not artificial brilliance, but authentic connection, a world where intelligence feels natural and personalization feels private. The company that once redefined how we communicate is now redefining how we coexist with technology. Because for Apple, the future isn't artificial, it's intimately human. As Apple stands at the threshold of its next great evolution, the story of its journey under Tim Cook offers profound lessons, not just in business, but in leadership, philosophy, and the art of endurance. Cook inherited a company built by a legend, surrounded by doubt, and expected to fail under the weight of history. Yet he transformed Apple into the world's most valuable corporation. Not through explosive charisma, but through quiet consistency. His leadership is a study in restraint, a reminder that in a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, stability is its own form of genius. Where Steve Jobs created revolutions, Cook created resilience. And in business, as in life, revolutions may inspire, but resilience sustains. Cook's story teaches that humility and discipline can outlast even the brightest flashes of charisma. He rarely speaks in superlatives, never tries to imitate Jobs' showmanship, and often lets results speak louder than words. This humility isn't weakness, it's control. The control to listen longer, decide slower, and act decisively. Under his leadership, Apple mastered the art of doing fewer things better. Every product, every launch, every expansion reflects Cook's belief that excellence is not about doing everything, but doing the essential things flawlessly. It's a philosophy rooted not in ego but in endurance. The man who once stood in the shadow of a visionary has proven that you don't need to be loud to lead a revolution. You just need to be consistent enough to outlast one. Beyond business strategy, Apple's trajectory under Cook also highlights the importance of ethical innovation. In an era where technology often races ahead of morality, Apple has chosen a slower, more deliberate path. It prioritizes user trust, data privacy, and human well-being over algorithmic addiction. Its refusal to trade privacy for profit is not just good branding, it's a moral stance. That may one day define the standard for responsible technology. Apple reminds the world that innovation without ethics is chaos, and that the companies that survive are the ones that align technological progress with human values. In a sense, Cook turned Apple into the conscience of Silicon Valley, a role more powerful than any market share or quarterly report. Apple's longevity also comes from its ability to reinvent without losing itself. Few companies have mastered the balance between heritage and evolution as gracefully as Apple. Its design language, simplicity, and focus on user experience remain timeless, yet its reach has expanded into health, spatial computing, and AI fields that barely existed when the first iPhone launched. The secret lies in Apple's refusal to chase trends. Instead, it studies, refines, and perfects. This patience, often mistaken for conservatism, is actually discipline, a belief that the future must be crafted, not rushed. Through this lens, Apple becomes more than a company. It's a living organism. It's constantly regenerating without ever forgetting its DNA. There's a philosophical elegance in how Apple designs technology to disappear. The most advanced devices, from the iPhone to the Vision Pro, aim not to dominate your attention, but to blend seamlessly into your life. Apple's ideal product is not one that demands to be noticed, but one that allows the user to be noticed. It's the realization of Arthur C. Clarke's famous line, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." For Apple, the truest form of magic is invisibility, when the interface dissolves and only the experience remains. In that sense, Apple's pursuit of minimalism isn't aesthetic. It's metaphysical. As the next decade unfolds, Apple's ambitions reach beyond devices. The long-awaited Apple Car may redefine mobility the way the iPhone redefined communication, an intelligent, integrated, and sustainable ecosystem on wheels. In health, Apple's quiet advances in biometrics and wearable sensors are steadily transforming wellness into a form of proactive intelligence. And in spatial computing, Vision Pro may evolve from a niche luxury to a universal interface, bridging the physical and digital worlds with grace. Each of these pursuits shares one unifying thread. Apple is no longer in the business of making products. It's in the business of designing human experience. And perhaps that is the ultimate reflection. From the garage in Cupertino to the shimmering glass ring of Apple Park, the company's journey mirrors humanity's own, a quest to merge intelligence, creativity, and meaning. Every iPhone, every line of code, every keynote speech is an exploration of what it means to be alive in an age of machines. Tim Cook's Apple doesn't simply build technology to serve us, it builds it to understand us. And as we stand on the edge of a world where the digital and human will soon become indistinguishable, one truth remains. Perhaps Apple's true mission isn't to create technology, but to redefine what it means to be human in a digital age. There's a quiet rhythm that defines the end of every era. Not a crash, not a headline, but a silence. A silence filled with the hum of possibility. Apple stands in that silence now, on the edge of another transformation. The company that once placed 1,000 songs in our pockets and 1,000 connections in our hands now whispers of something deeper, something that lives, not in our devices, but in our perception. The story of Apple has never been about machines. It has always been about moments, the click of a button, slide of a screen, the quiet awe of seeing something familiar feel completely new. And once again, that feeling is returning. For 2 decades, the iPhone has been the center of our digital universe, the tool through which we learned, worked, loved, and lived. It became more than a product. It became a limb, a mirror, a companion. But even the most iconic inventions must one day step aside for what comes next. With the rise of Apple Intelligence and Vision Pro, the world begins to glimpse a new horizon, one where technology no longer lives behind glass, but within the very fabric of our reality. The question, then, is not whether Apple can reinvent itself again. The question is whether we are ready for what it's about to become. Perhaps the end of the iPhone era isn't an ending at all, but a metamorphosis. Apple's greatest strength has always been its ability to make change feel inevitable, to turn the unfamiliar into the intuitive. The same company that once asked us to think different now asks us to feel different. The shift toward AI, spatial computing, and invisible interfaces isn't about abandoning the past. It's about transcending it. The iPhone didn't simply connect us, it prepared us for a world where technology listens, learns, and responds with empathy. The next Apple product may not live in your hand, but within your world, shaping how you see, think, and interact with everything around you. And yet, amid all this progress, one truth endures. Apple's story has always been, and will always be, a human one. Behind every line of code, there is intention. Behind every product, a philosophy. Behind every keynote, a whisper of hope that technology can make us not just more capable, but more compassionate. As AI begins to weave itself into the rhythms of daily life, Apple's challenge is not to make machines smarter, but to ensure humans remain at the center of their own story. The future of Apple will depend not on how much it can automate, but on how deeply it can understand. There is poetry in the way Apple approaches progress, slow, deliberate, and deeply reflective. Where others rush to unveil the future, Apple waits for the right moment to make it meaningful. The company understands that innovation is not a race. It's a conversation between time, necessity, and imagination. Every decade, Apple redefines what it means to live with technology, and every time, does so not by shouting louder, but by listening better. That humility, that quiet confidence, is what allows Apple to shape the future without ever needing to declare it. And so, as the world watches Apple step into this new age of intelligence, we are invited to wonder, are we witnessing the end of the iPhone era, or the beginning of something even greater? Will Apple's next revolution be one we can see, or one we can feel? Perhaps the real transformation won't come from new devices, but from the way we experience reality itself. The future Apple envisions may not ask us to look down at screens, but to look up into a world where technology becomes invisible, seamless, and human once more. Because in the end, Apple's greatest story has never been about its products. It has been about us, our desires, our fears, our endless search for connection and meaning. Every innovation, from the first Mac to the Vision Pro, reflects our collective evolution, our attempt to merge intellect with imagination and humanity with creation. And so, as Apple moves deeper into the unknown, it leaves us with a feeling more powerful than certainty, wonder. The sense that, once again, something extraordinary is just about to begin.